Hello, students. This is Professor Gore, and this is part three of the Progressive Era recorded lecture. And so, in this part, we're going to get into progressivism on the national level. So, part one, we kind of covered more of what actually progressivism was for this time, and then part two, we talked about some local level and state level progressive era reforms. So, as I mentioned before, and emphasize again, the majority of the progressive reforms happen at the local and state level, and it varied from place to place how much of this, but every state is eventually going to pass a workingman's compensation, insurance protection, and so forth. So what really changed at the national level is that you had progressive era presidents. Theodore Roosevelt, who was born in 1858, was motivated by a high-minded Christian upbringing who identified himself with the cause of righteousness. After Harvard, Roosevelt found himself in Republican politics and ended up serving in the New York State legislature. Now, he held several different positions in his life. His father made quite a bit of money in the glass making business, but Teddy Roosevelt had been New York police commissioner at one point, had served in the New York State legislature, had been assistant to Secretary of the Navy, became a war hero in the Spanish-American War. As he fought in the Rough Rider unit, he was a second in command for that unit, along with the two all-black regiments, helped take San Juan Hill in that particular war. When he came back from the war, he was a war hero and kind of promoted that about himself and became the governor of New York. Now, the Republicans put him as a vice president in the election 1900 with McKinley, was to kind of get rid of him. But then McKinley gets assassinated by Leon Czolgosz. So what ends up happening is Teddy Roosevelt becomes a reform-minded president. When his time in office, he was actually fairly moderate. He wasn't as radical as those radical aspects of society where he wasn't as conservative as the most conservative aspects, but he pushed and directed the country to regulating the economy to a certain extent. He wasn't near the regulation that comes later in American history, but also consumer protection and conservation, and really became, well, his face is on Mount Rushmore for a reason. So let's look at what he does for regulating the marketplace. Now, when he runs for president, because he serves 3.5 years in McKinley's second term, and when he runs and gets elected in 1904, he promises that he's going to view the first term as the first 3.5 years as his first term, and then this will be his second term. So he said he wouldn't run in 1908, which he's going to come to regret, and he's going to try to run again in 1912, which cost the Republicans the White House. So anyway, in the aftermath of the Depression of the 1890s, businesses rushed to merge with their competitors, forming monopolies or trusts, as they were called, which eliminated competition. By 1910, 1% of the nation's manufacturers accounted for 44% of the nation's industrial output. Now, Teddy Roosevelt is going to be the first president to use the Sherman Antitrust Act effectively. So one of the things that Teddy Roosevelt did, and this is a book cartoon about him, he was kind of considered the trust buster and so forth. He referred to using the White House as like a bully pulpit. And so what's interesting about Teddy Roosevelt as kind of more of a moderate, he didn't view all monopolies as bad. He just viewed the monopolies that exploited the consumers and their workers as bad. And so as long as he did admire monopolies for their efficiency, if they were offering fair prices to the consumers, fair wages, and decent working conditions, he was happy with them. He is the first American president to ever take the side of labor. There was a coal miners dispute at the anthracite coal mining area of Pennsylvania, and there was going to be some problems, and he ended up telling that the mining business that they had to agree to an arbitration. Now, did he take the miner owner's side? No. Did he take the labor side? No. He just made them agree to arbitration, so at least the labor would have a fair chance. He also is going to be the first president to truly regulate railroads. The Interstate Commerce Commission was passed with the intention of regulating railroads, but really was like a shark with no teeth. It didn't really have any true power. And so he is going to pass the Elkins and Mann Act, who are going to regulate that. So, for instance, the Elkins Act of 1903 prohibited discriminatory railroad rates, unfairly favoring preferred or powerful customers. So he tried to protect consumers and so forth from this. He also wanted to limit corruption in the workplace, but really his most lasting achievement is conservation. Now, we've already covered the Panama Canal in the American Expansion lecture, which the canal and his environmental conservation is his most famous achievements. So one of the things that he does, he's the first president to bust up a monopoly. It was called Northern Security. It was a railroad monopoly that combined three different railroad entities. J.P. Morgan owned part of that. He had it dissolved in 1904. And then he took on the nation's giant firms, including Standard Oil, American Tobacco, and DuPont. He also attacked the Beef Trust, Sugar, Fertilizer, Harvester, and other key products trust. Roosevelt wanted economic prosperity, but also wanted to show the government ran the country, not big business. But Roosevelt was not anti-business. He actually was pro-business. He just wanted fair business. He regarded large-scale enterprise as a national tendency of modern industrialization, and he admired them for their efficiency. Only firms that abuse their power deserve punishment in his mind. The Trans-Missouri decision in 1897 proved the courts could not always be trusted to properly use the Sherman Antitrust Act because they had protected a monopoly. Roosevelt proved reasonable when he struck a deal with the U.S. Steel by allowing the Bureau of Corporations to examine their books to make sure they were not doing any wrong, and if they were, give them the opportunity to correct it. So he's a fair-minded individual. Roosevelt did this to show he could accommodate modern industrial order while maintaining his public image as a slayer of the trust. He was a brilliant politician at this. So what he runs on this thing where he basically says, I want to give every American a square deal. What that means is he wants them to have a fair shot. Okay, so here's the four areas: control of corporations, okay with good ones, give bad ones opportunity to reform. Okay, end of railroad rebates. He does that with the Elkins Act. He also wants to pass consumer protection. He does that with the Federal Meat Inspection Act of 1906, as well as the Pure Food and Drug Act around the same time. And what this does is it basically makes it where if you're selling a food product or a pharmaceutical, you have to have proper labeling, and it has to actually contain what the label says it does, which there was people that were cheating that before that. It also creates the Food and Drug Administration, which has been important government administration. He also passes the Hepburn Railway Act, which empowered the Interstate Commerce Commission to set maximum shipping rates and prescribe uniform methods of bookkeeping. Okay, and conservation of natural resources is really what he is most known for. Now, this is a political cartoon based on where he had gone hunting in Louisiana, and they were having trouble. He was going bear hunting, and there used to be a lot more bears in Louisiana at the time. And this owner was wanting him to be able to kill a bear, so they captured one and then tied it up to a tree. When he came up to it, he's like, "This isn't hunting," and he released the bear. And so that's where they got this idea of creating, literally, somebody wise business person started selling teddy bears named after the president, and it's now one of the most widely sold stuffed animals. In fact, both my children have teddy bears. So, and this is political cartoon reference to he's slaying the bad trust, but he's taming the good trust. I love this political cartoon. This is the Sherman Antitrust Act coming out of the grave, punching monopolists, and so forth. So he effectively uses the Sherman Antitrust Act. He also passed the Elkins and Hepburn Act to regulate the railroads. If you don't remember specifically what they do, that's okay, as long as you remember Elkins Act, Hepburn Act regulates railroads. And now its conservation policy really is incredible. He believed that resources should be used, yet conserved to keep them for future generations. His Public Lands Commission in 1903 tripled the number of national forests, removed additional millions of acres of coal lands from private development, and added national parks and many national monuments. He also expanded the Forest Service with Gifford Pinchot as leader. In fact, he established more national parks than the present, but he established 5. In 1902, the Newland Reclamation Act authorized irrigation projects for reclaiming settled arid western lands. Many ranchers and loggers fought back as they were not used to government regulation and fought to a draw. Okay, so he does found the national park system. He did a lot of this through executive orders. He kind of did it quietly, and it kind of became out more at the end of his presidency what he always had done. So now you can look at the years. Obviously, he didn't establish national parks in all these areas. You look at a lot of those years were done after him. But I love the national park system. If you haven't got a chance to visit one, please do. It is awesome. We have some of the greatest national parks anywhere in the world. We have some beautiful landscapes. I've been to several of these. I've been to Hot Springs, Great Smoky Mountains, Shenandoah, Rocky Mountain National Park, Grand Canyon, Arches, Mount Rainier, and then a couple in Alaska. So I've actually been outside of Wrangell St. Elias in Alaska. Pretty cool. So he also helped establish a new water project, what's called the Newlands Irrigation Project, that really, without it, we wouldn't be able to have water for a lot of Northern California. It was controversial at the time, certainly, but it does allow the economic growth of California later. This is a cartoon in reference to the muckraking being dug up at that time. And Upton Sinclair's The Jungle helped lead to the Pure Food and Drug Act. Here's a picture of some meat packers. Oh, it would have been a tough place to work back then. So the Pure Food and Drug Act, Meat Inspection Act provide consumer protection. It's a good thing. Okay, this is him taming the meatpacking industry. Oftentimes they had him dressed as a cowboy or in his colonel outfit with the Rough Riders. And Colliers wrote about the bad things in the pharmaceutical industry, and that helps the Pure Food and Drug Act. We covered the anthracite coal mining strike. He made the mining company and the labor union agree to an arbitration. Okay, so he was considered a hero of the common man. And he does establish the Department of Commerce in 1903. And he ends up leaving the White House in 1909, and he actually goes on a year-long African safari and selects Taft as his successor. Now, election of 1908, Taft wins. He really didn't want the presidency. He really wanted to be the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, but his wife wanted to be president, and so happy wife, happy life for Taft. He actually became a chaplain when he did become Chief Justice of the Supreme Court later after leaving the White House. William Jennings Bryan runs for a third time, and he is 0 for 3. So what all does Taft do? Now, this is a picture of Taft years after he left the presidency, and he's lost 100 pounds, and he looks very happy and jovial. It's because he was as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He actually does a great job for the Wilson administration during World War I, heading up the labor board. So Taft actually had probably a more successful career after the presidency than he even did during the presidency. So he'd been a judge that was very good, also been a good administrator and governor of the Philippines. He did not trust power and was a conservative, while Teddy had been a moderate. Taft was able to beat William Jennings Bryan, and Taft basically faced troubles right out of the get-go. The Republicans were split between conservatives and progressives. One issue that divided the Republican Party was the tariff. Progressives believed that tariffs were a major reason why competition declined and trust had taken hold. Still, Taft had won thanks to the conservative Republican support, which led him to sign the Payne-Aldrich Tariff Act of 1909. Things worsened for Taft when his Secretary of the Interior, Richard A. Bollinger, was accused by Roosevelt's head of the Forester, Gifford Pinchot, of plotting to transfer resource-rich Alaskan land to private business group. The Pinchot-Bollinger affair caused Taft to fire Pinchot for insubordination, and the progressives threw Taft in with the Republican and conservative Speaker of the House, Joe Cannon, when he was removed as Speaker in 1910. Now, this is a political cartoon of Taft. It seems like he's overwhelmed in the White House. He says, "Oh, I must have been dozing," and then Teddy Roosevelt's looking on. And so once TR sees that his good friend Gifford Pinchot gets fired, he decides, I'm going to run again. And this is where he says his famous line, "My hat is still in the ring." And so what happens is the Republican Party splits. And what's going to happen is Roosevelt is going to pull votes away from Taft, and it's going to allow Woodrow Wilson to win. So Roosevelt, in the election of 1912, went on a campaign trail, actually 2 years before that in 1910 in Kansas, and called his plan New Nationalism. He's a little more liberal when he runs in 1912 than he was when he was president. He believed that the federal government could regulate nations' industrial corporations by a federal trade commission as if they were natural monopolies or public entities. He also believed that the government would become the steward of the public welfare. He did push for a new federal child labor law, which Wilson passes. Even though Wilson was his arch nemesis in politics, Wilson actually and him didn't disagree on that much. He also called for sharp curbs of the judicial branch's power. He announced his decision to run for president early 1912 and it would lead to the split. He also pushed for women to have the right to vote. In fact, was the first presidential candidate in American history to ever be announced as the nominee of a new progressive party that they called the Bull Moose Party, by Jane Addams. So it was the first time a woman ever introduced him. And so the reason why their mascot was a bull moose was somebody asked how he's feeling. He says, "I feel as healthy and strong as a bull moose." Teddy Roosevelt's a big hunter. So this is him speaking on the campaign trail. So this is a political cartoon basically talking about the Republican split and the Democrats win. All right, so he did push for direct election senators, which Wilson gets passed. He did push for tariff reduction. Wilson also passed that. He did push for presidential primaries. Also happens later. He did push for regulation of monopolies. Wilson also does that. And he push for the end of child labor, which Wilson passed, and then later it gets declared unconstitutional. And he does push for women's suffrage. Wilson reluctantly did that at the end of his presidency. So you look at him, he and Wilson's New Freedom are not that different, and kind of interesting. So Eugene Debs ran as a socialist and got about 6% of the vote. And you can look right here. If you would have taken Roosevelt and Taft's votes, they would have easily won the election. Wilson only won with 42% of the vote. So really the Republicans shot themselves in the foot. Roosevelt got more popular votes than Taft. Really what I think is fascinating and shows that Roosevelt was a boss. At one point on the campaign trail, and he was actually starting to gain a lot more popularity. I don't think he would have won still, but he would have done a little bit better than what he did. Somebody walks up to him when he's getting ready to speak and shoots him right in the chest, point blank. Now, what saved his life is he had his glasses case, and he had a huge, thick 50-page speech folded up, and it did dislodge the bullet into his chest. But like a boss, he gets up there and gives an hour-and-a-half long speech with a bullet in his chest. If that guy's not a hoss, please tell me who is. His speak was kind of weakened because he did have a bullet in his chest and ends up going to the hospital. It takes him about 2 weeks to recover, and he kind of lost momentum for the election, and Wilson wins. So you can see right there, Taft only won a couple states. Roosevelt won a few, but if you would have really combined he and Taft's votes, the Republicans would have won in the election of 1912. All right, so let's look at what Wilson is going to do. Now, this is Wilson throwing a pitch, or well, he's not throwing a first pitch, but he's throwing a ball back from the stands at a baseball game, which baseball was America's pastime at this time, and a great time to go see baseball in action. You can tell I'm a little biased towards baseball. Let's look at what all Wilson accomplishes during his presidency. Now, he does appoint the first Jewish American to the Supreme Court, Louis D. Brandeis, who became known as a progressive lawyer. So I always tell students, this is how you remember it, the triple wall of privilege, TBT, okay? The three areas that Wilson reforms are tariff, banks, trusts. So I used to have my high school students say, tariff, banks, trusts, tariff, banks, trusts, tariff, banks, trusts. So he is going to reduce the tariff that he thought unfairly protected American industries and didn't protect American farmers. He is going to regulate the banking industry by creating the Federal Reserve and spreading out the nation's currency across the lower 48 states. And then he is going to regulate trust. So he does accomplish a lot of his campaign promises. So how does he reform the tariffs? Well, he passed the Underwood Tariff Act of 1913, just lowered the tariff. All right, if you can just remember the Underwood Tariff, brings it under, it lowers it, okay? Now, how did he get stuff passed? Congress would have been a little more resistant, but what happens is when he wants something passed, he travels around the country and gives these riveting speeches, because he was a very talented public speaker, to the public, and then tells them, hey, go mess with your congressman or woman to, well, it was man at the time, to get this thing passed. And that through public pressure, the congressmen end up passing a lot of this legislation. He was really good at that. Now, Roosevelt, who definitely would like to talk and hear himself talk a lot, came off a lot more warm to people in private. Wilson kind of came off warm and big public mass speeches, but when you met him in private, he came off cold. And so once people got to know him personally, he wasn't as well liked. Now, the banking reform is because it was a recession in 1909, and there was a shortage of currency. So what it does is the Federal Reserve Act creates 12 regional reserve banks, and it spreads the nation's currency out among the rest of the country. So let's say there's a currency crisis. If we have a Federal Reserve in Seattle, they can redistribute currency more easily to the Pacific Northwest. There's a Federal Reserve in Dallas. Okay. And so it was actually a recession in 1907. And so the Federal Reserve Board sets interest rates, still set the federal interest rates today for like home loans and so forth. Now, to reform trust, he basically creates a more robust and buff Sherman Antitrust Act. It's called the Clayton Antitrust Act, named after the congressman who authored it. And it also attacked price discriminations. And you could not serve as a director of two competing companies. So you couldn't have the CEO of AT&T serving on the board of directors of Verizon. Okay, makes sense. And it did legalize strikes and peaceful picketing. Also, the Federal Trade Commission is going to investigate businesses of improper things. Okay. Now, at this time, you have increasing number of radicals, particularly anarchists, and one of them, one labor union called the Wobblies, Industrial Workers of the World, one of their members set off a bomb at the LA Times newspaper office for printing an article that spoke out against them. So a lot of Americans feared class warfare at this time because some countries in Europe were very much on the verge of this, and Russia ends up having it with the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. And so Wilson does create a U.S. Commission on Industrial Relations to try to help ease laborers' tensions and fears. And he also passed a federal child labor law, which is called the Owens-Keating Act of 1916, but it gets declared unconstitutional. So why in the world would the Supreme Court declare the Owens-Keating Act unconstitutional? Well, it sounds logical once you hear the court case. There was a father in North Carolina who owned his own business, and he had his children work for him. Okay. They still went to school part-time, but he was like, look, my employees are my children. This is a family-owned business. If I can't have them working, I can't make my business operate. And the Supreme Court said, you know what, you're right. And they ruled unconstitutional. So how does child labor laws go into effect? They go into effect at the state level. And that Supreme Court doesn't judge on, at least in that particular time. He also passed an 8-hour law for railroad workers. Okay, so they're going to work up to 8 hours a day. He also passed the Lafayette-Siemens Act, which was drafted by progressive Congressman Robert Lafayette, who'd been the governor of Wisconsin, and eliminates some of the sailors that had some terrible working conditions on the high seas. The Federal Farm Act of 1916, Warehouse Act of 1916 as well. All of these are before the United States enters World War I. Basically, what the Federal Farm Loan Act does is makes credit available to farmers at low rates of interest, so farmers can borrow at a cheaper rate. The Warehouse Act authorized loans on the security of staple crops, so you could get a loan based on your crops. The Workingmen's Compensation Act of 1916 granted assistance to federal civil service employees during periods of disability. So it basically is workingmen's comp for federal government employees. But Wilson was actually probably one of our top two most racist presidents in American history. He grew up in Georgia, attended, got his PhD at Johns Hopkins. His first wife passed away, and he almost resigned when she died in his first term, but then he remarries and kind of reinvigorates himself. But as historians will always say that his racism is really his downfall of him personally, but he does a lot of other good things. And so it's like on some hands, historians really like him, and other hands are like, come on, Wilson, don't be so racist. All right, so he does pass 4 different amendments in his 8 years. Okay, and that's really tough. You can tell the movement, the progressive era, has gained in the 1910s. But I always tell kids there's two acronyms you can use to remember the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th amendments. You can either use I saw, or I do pray on Sundays, or I don't pray on Sundays, depending on your religious preference. So I think I saw is a little bit the easiest, but I is income tax. That's the 16th Amendment. It provided a federal income tax it was graduated based on how much you made. The S is senators. So the 17th Amendment is going to provide direct election of senators. And then the A is alcohol, so the prohibition of alcohol. And the W is women's rights. The women get the right to vote in the 19th Amendment. If you use I do pray on Sundays, it's income tax, direct election of senators, prohibition, and suffrage. Okay, so I would use one of those to help you memorize it. 17th Amendment, now we get to decide who's going to become a senator. Before, state legislatures had decided that from the Constitution all the way until 1913. Now, the 18th Amendment, the reason why it gets passed, okay, is because it was passed in 1919, the year after World War I ended. We had just fought the Germans, and it was passed as seen as being anti-German because a lot of the German Americans owned taverns at this time. It's because of that prejudice that the 18th Amendment got passed. If it wasn't for World War I, 18th Amendment probably never would have gone into effect. It would have been passed at some of the state level, but not the federal level. And the 19th Amendment, one of our most important amendments in American history, women get the right to vote. Okay. We've covered periodically throughout the course. If you've had me for U.S. History 1, we talked about during Reconstruction when the two suffrage movements split because of African Americans getting the right to vote. The men do, and not women. They get really angered about that. Carrie Chapman Catt is the leader of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, who kind of gets the ball across the goal line and with the 19th Amendment. Here are women marching on Washington, demanding the right to vote. Okay. And you can look at the states that already allowed women to have some voting at this time, but many states on the eastern half did not allow women to have the right to vote. All right, and that's it. We'll get to World War I in the next topic.